Well, we've reached the end of another semester of mostly remote teaching. And I thought it would be a good time to do a bit of reflection on my remote teaching experience over the last semester. Hi, I'm Greg Tucker-Kellogg, a professor at the National University of Singapore, and this is just a personal channel of mine dealing with issues in educational technology focused on higher education. So let's get started. So this semester, I had a really heavy teaching load. I taught 3 classes, which is unusual. We call them modules at NUS, but I taught 3 modules and I taught them effectively on my own. There were no other faculty members associated with any of those modules. Of course, I did have some teaching assistants for whom I'm very grateful. Okay, so what were those 3 modules? The first one was a relatively large module. It was 115 students. This was introductory bioinformatics taken by second-year students in life sciences, pharmaceutical sciences, computational biology, and those wanting to minor in bioinformatics. The second module is a module that's for fourth-year students. So this is called Advanced Topics in Bioinformatics, and it's a small self-selective module, mostly computational biology students, and it deals with topics in the literature. Those first 2 modules I've taught for a number of years. The third module it is a brand new module. This is a graduate module on practical analysis of genomic data using R, and we had 14 students in that module. The 3 modules range a lot. The first module I taught entirely online. The second module I taught a mix of online and in person. And the third module I taught again entirely online. So what was the setup? So in this, I'm going to do a video on each of those modules on how the actual education went, what my experience was in each of those, a little bit of a reflection on those. But in this, I want to just focus on some of the educational technology choices that I made. So I used a common software setup for synchronous remote classes. I tried to use synchronous teaching as much as possible so that it didn't have that kind of Coursera feel of disconnection. So what were some of those software choices? It was Zoom, of course. We were all using Zoom. But in my case, I was using OBS 100% of the time as the source for going into Zoom. This has a number of advantages, and I think the students had some great experiences from those advantages. Now, my Zoom setup was probably a little bit unusual for people who do use OBS and Zoom. In particular, I made the choice somewhere in the middle of the year to switch over from a virtual camera to 100% use of NDI. And if you're not familiar with NDI, I'll probably do another video or 2 on that and why I think that's preferable. The short form of that is I could use the main NDI output, that is the main OBS output, I could capture using an application called NDI Studio Monitor. This meant that I could look at the output of that, as I am right now, actually, and that was available as a shared screen in Zoom. So it functioned both as a confidence monitor for me and as a shared screen in Zoom, with all the high resolution and performance of a shared screen in Zoom. At the same time, I set a dedicated NDI output filter on the OBS scene for the camera. And that meant that that scene was available as a constant unchanging webcam in Zoom. And that's different from the way a lot of people use OBS in Zoom, where often their webcam and their shared screen, if they bring in a virtual camera as a shared screen, those are mirroring each other and it just looks a little weird. One of my goals was to make OBS invisible. When I say I want to make OBS invisible, of course I'm using OBS all the time. I'm using it to stream into Zoom. I'm using it as a virtual camera. I'm using it as the source of my shared screen. But what I do is I put OBS on a non-visible desktop. So you can have these virtual desktops in Windows or Mac or Linux. And I just put the entire OBS application on a non-visible desktop, so I never see it. Then I use the NDI Studio Monitor to display what's currently displayed in OBS. Again, I'm doing that right now to record this video. And then I use Stream Deck, a Stream Deck piece of hardware, to control OBS. So I'm never actually clicking on any of the OBS interfaces to change scenes. I'm just using OBS, and that allows me to keep I'm just using the Stream Deck to control OBS, and that allows me to use whatever software that I'm using for teaching as the primary software that I'm interacting with. And why go through all of this trouble? It seems like extra trouble to do this, but the reason is really simple. This allows me to focus my attention on student learning and on my own teaching, not having to worry about OBS at all as an application that I'm directly interacting with. Really does help. It really does allow me to focus my own attention on my own teaching and on the student learning experience. If you're wondering what this is like, I actually have an NDI camera now behind me. This is the an NDI camera focused on what I see. And you can see the OBS scene is actually in my teleprompter monitor up above. And here's my main monitor, and here's my PowerPoint, which is basically showing the text that you were just seeing. But I can go over to the other desktop. So this is now a desktop just to the right, a virtual desktop under Windows, and here is OBS running. And again, you see the same OBS scene running in that desktop. And but that's not what I'm interacting with. I'm just interacting with the Stream Deck, which is to my left and out of the camera frame. Okay, so that goal is to make OBS invisible. I actually have a similar goal for Zoom. I want to make Zoom as close to invisible as possible. It's not quite possible in the same way that it is for OBS to make it completely invisible, but I can make it mostly invisible, basically never having the Zoom application in focus unless I absolutely need to. So I keep the Zoom application out of focus. I'm, again, keeping my focus on either my PowerPoint or a PDF or maybe RStudio or some other application that I'm using with the students. Perhaps it's a browser. It really depends on the subject matter that's being taught. I use Stream Deck to control some Zoom functions. So I use it to control the mute, the screen share, and so on. Of course, this has a consequence. I avoid all the fancy Zoom features. I never use a Zoom whiteboard. I never use a Zoom poll. I never use Zoom apps. And the reason is because, again, I want to get everything out of the way. I want to focus my attention on student learning and on my own teaching. It may seem counterintuitive to avoid that application, but the difference is really dramatic because I can switch between cameras, right? So I can switch to another camera. I can switch to my overhead camera. In this case, it's just showing my coffee. Oh, you can see the Stream Deck here a little bit. I can switch to that overhead camera. I can switch back to the main camera, or in this case, the PowerPoint and so on. And all of that happens seamlessly. So if a student has a question, I can stop and address that question and stay within the same streamlined framework that I'm using. And I'm never interrupted by having to switch applications. I don't have to stop the screen share, start the screen share, anything like that. I'm just constantly sharing the screen that is coming through the NDI studio monitor and capturing the output of OBS. So that's the basic setup. What worked? Well, there's a couple of pages of this, which is why it's numbered. The first is that OBS to Zoom commitment made a lot of difference. It allowed for a very smooth transition between apps, the camera, the dock cam. In every way, it just worked really, really well. Another is getting OBS and Zoom out of the way worked quite well. Having that dedicated screen share from OBS through the NDI Studio Monitor app is, in my view, far preferable to using a virtual camera. It has all the advantages of a virtual camera and some features that a virtual camera doesn't have. It's an ordinary window, so it doesn't require, say, in sharing a Zoom, if you want to share a virtual screen into Zoom, you have to go into the advanced settings and share that and so on. That's just a nuisance. And the other thing is I put the chat and participant list on the side. Now, what do I mean by that? In this case, it's because I have a 34-inch monitor. So I have an ultra-wide monitor. And that ultra-wide monitor allows me to do some things. And I'll show you what that looks like just right now. So what you're seeing right now is the typical thing that I'm looking at in a Zoom meeting. What you're seeing is a browser in this case, but it could be any other app, and that's fixed at. I set this up again using the Stream Deck and using a little macro and auto hotkey to set up any active window so that it has a 16:9 ratio in the center of the screen. And then I keep the participants list on one side and the chat on the other side. I can put them on the same side so it's more obvious here. I put the participants list and the chat on the sides. So as a Zoom is going on, even though I don't have Zoom in the front, I don't have Zoom as the main app that I'm working with, I do have access to the chat and I have access to the participant list. So I'm always able to know if a student raises their hand or if a student brings something into the chat. And what I've noticed is that students are a lot more willing to bring things into the chat or raise their hand in that way than they are to just interrupt in the audio. And so that makes for, in some ways, it actually makes it easier to deal in a large class with student questions than it would if I was having to say switch between an overhead cam and or another setting in a real class. Because if a student asks a question, I can just instantly go to my overhead cam and address that question and then come back into the main setting. Continuing on that list, having a confidence monitor, which is basically my teleprompter monitor that allows me to look into the camera and also allows me to see what the students are seeing because it's displaying the OBS scene. I use music before class, so I have a playlist and I play the music as students are waiting to come into class or are coming into class, and that allows students to come in and get comfortable into a virtual class and have it not be awkward. I get to share some music that I like. Good audio makes a difference. It's really important to me when I'm teaching, and my students have noticed that the choices that I make in audio are meaningful for them. And finally, an overhead cam makes a big difference. Just being able to address a student question by going instantly and seamlessly to an overhead cam, it actually is a lot more convenient doing it this way than it would be in a lecture theater where I have to switch back and forth between them and so on. And finally, I do use other software. There's one software that I use a lot, and it's used at our university, is Poll Everywhere. And that has in-class polls, in-class questions, sort of formative assessments, concept tests, and so on. That works really, really well. What didn't work so well? What didn't work so well? Well, marking. Teaching that much, I often fall behind on marking, and teaching that much made it that much harder. So I didn't do my marking very quickly, and that meant that I couldn't get feedback to the students very, very well. I also didn't do as many formative assessments in any of these classes as I imagined that I would have done at the beginning of the semester. And so those are real weaknesses. They're not particularly worse this year than they are in other years, except for the fact that the teaching load was high. What that meant was that getting feedback to students was sort of limited, because marking and formative assessments are really great ways to get feedback to students on their own learning. And so that was not something that I did particularly well. And finally, I was just exhausted with this much teaching, doing it remotely. And in particular, my large class lecture was on Thursday morning, and the brand new graduate class was held on Thursday evenings. By the time I got to that graduate class, I was already exhausted almost every week, and I think that probably showed in my teaching. So that's pretty much where we are, and I'll try to do a video on the actual structure and teaching and some of the things that I did within each of those classes. More pedagogical. This is really more about some of the technology choices that I used. If you're interested in hearing more about any of those particular technology choices, let me know in the comments. Let me know if this video is valuable to you and if you'd like to hear more on any of these topics or anything else in educational technology. And I'll see you in the next video.